There's a grave in the desert. Simple stone. No name carved on
Beneath
it.
that stone
Just a date.
lies a
And beneath
man.
that stone lies a man who never saw
was
the
born
world
during
beyond
siege,
fortress walls.
grew up
He was
under the
born during
shadow
a
of these
siege.
walls,
He grew up
and
during a
learned to
siege.
fight for his
He
home.
learned to fight during a siege. And
27
he died
years.
at 32 years old, still defending those same walls. His father had defended them before him. His son would defend them after him. 27 years. An entire generation grew up knowing nothing but war. Children who played in courtyards where arrows
For a
fell like
fortress
rain.
that most
Teenagers
maps
who
didn't
learned
mark.
to shoot before they learned to read. Young men who became old men without
The
ever knowing
greatest
peace.
military
And
power.
all of it, all that sacrifice, all those years, all those lives, for a fortress that most maps
Few
didn't
hundred
even
defenders
bother to
somehow
mark.
hold them
A
back.
small desert fort that an empire thought would fall in weeks. Picture this. The greatest military power in the known world sends army after army. Tens of thousands of soldiers with the best equipment, the best training, unlimited resources. And a few hundred defenders in a crumbling desert fortress, surrounded by sand and heat and death, somehow hold them back. For 27 years, emperors came and went. Military commanders built their careers trying to capture this one fortress and failed. Soldiers who arrived as young men left as old veterans, if they left at all. Entire generations were consumed by this siege, attacking a fortress that refused to fall, defending walls that should have crumbled decades ago. That man in the unmarked grave? He was one of thousands. Defenders who never surrendered, who held a position that logic said was indefensible, who fought not because they believed they'd win, but because surrender wasn't in their vocabulary. His mother buried him in the fortress cemetery, next to his father's grave. She'd buried her husband 12 years earlier. She'd bury her grandson 8 years later. 3 generations of her family, all killed defending the same walls. All part of a 27-year siege that became the empire's obsession and its humiliation. This is the story of how a desert fortress held back an empire. How geography and determination defeated unlimited resources. How a few hundred people, replaced generation after generation as they died, held a position that the greatest military minds of the era couldn't conquer. Stay with me, because what happened in that desert fortress will challenge everything you think you know about warfare. It's not about the biggest army or the best weapons. It's about will. About the refusal to quit even when victory seems impossible. About ordinary people doing extraordinary things simply because they refuse to accept defeat. If you skip this story, you're walking past that unmarked grave without acknowledging what it represents. Without understanding that the man buried there, and thousands like him, gave everything for a cause that seemed hopeless. Without learning that sometimes, the smallest fortress can stop the largest empire. They fought for 27 years. Parents and children and grandchildren, all defending the same ground, all refusing to surrender. And they changed history. Let me tell you how. Main body, the setup. The fortress wasn't supposed to matter. It sat in the middle of nowhere, a small fortification built centuries earlier to guard a desert trade route that wasn't particularly important anymore. The walls were old stone, weathered by sandstorms and brutal desert sun. The garrison was maybe 300 soldiers, supplemented by local families who'd settled around the fortress over generations. There were a few wells, precious sources of water in the desert, and enough storage to hold supplies for a few months if rationed carefully. No one would have called it strategic. No one would have thought it was worth fighting for. It was just a desert outpost, one of hundreds that dotted the frontier between civilized lands and the wasteland beyond. But it had one quality that would make it legendary. It controlled the only reliable water sources for 100 miles in any direction. The empire that would spend 27 years trying to capture it had been expanding for decades. A powerful military machine that had conquered kingdoms, absorbed smaller states, pushed its borders outward in all directions. Their armies were professional, well-trained, supplied by a sophisticated logistics system that could maintain forces in hostile territory indefinitely. They'd defeated everyone who'd stood against them. City-states that had existed for centuries fell within weeks. Mountain fortresses that were supposed to be impregnable were taken in months. The empire's expansion seemed unstoppable, inevitable, like a force of nature sweeping across the map. The desert frontier was their next target. The lands beyond were wealthy, trade cities, agricultural regions that could provide tax revenue and resources. All the empire needed to do was push through the desert, establish control of the borderlands, and the riches beyond would be theirs. The fortress sat directly on their planned route of advance. Not a major obstacle, just a minor fort that would need to be secured before the main army could push forward. The imperial commanders barely discussed it in their planning sessions. It would fall quickly, a week, maybe two if the defenders were stubborn. Then the real campaign could begin. They sent 5,000 soldiers to take it. Experienced troops, well-equipped, led by a competent officer who'd captured fortresses before. It should have been routine. The siege began in early spring, when desert temperatures were still manageable. The imperial army surrounded the fortress, cutting it off from any possible relief. They examined the walls, noted the weak points, prepared their siege equipment. The commander sent the traditional surrender demand, offering generous terms because he wanted to move quickly. The fortress commander's response was brief: "Come and take it." The imperial officer smiled when he heard this. He'd heard similar bravado before, from defenders who thought old walls would save them. They all surrendered eventually. This would be no different. The first assault came 3 days later. A straightforward attack, siege towers, ladders, battering ram against the main gate. The imperial soldiers were confident, almost casual. This was barely worth their time. The fortress would fall by sunset, and they'd be moving on to the real campaign within the week. The attack broke within 4 hours. The defenders fought with a desperation that shocked the attackers. Every foot of wall was contested. Every ladder that reached the battlements was pushed back or burned. The gate held despite the battering rams' repeated impacts. Imperial soldiers who breached the outer defenses found themselves in kill zones where defenders poured down arrows, stones, and burning oil. By nightfall, the Imperial army had pulled back, having lost over 300 men. The fortress stood intact, its defenders bloodied but victorious. The Imperial commander was irritated but not concerned. First assaults often failed. They'd try again with better preparation. The fortress would still fall. It would just take a bit longer than planned. He had no idea he'd just begun a siege that would last 27 years. That he'd die trying to take this fortress, along with thousands of his soldiers. That multiple emperors would commit resources to capturing this unremarkable desert fort, and all would fail. The defenders understood something the empire didn't. They weren't just fighting for a fortress. They were fighting for survival. If they surrendered, if they abandoned their position, they had nowhere to go. The desert would kill them. The empire would enslave them. This fortress was their home, their lives, their entire world. So they fought, not expecting to win, not believing relief would come, fighting simply because the alternative was unacceptable. And as days turned to weeks, as weeks turned to months, as the siege ground on with no end in sight, something became clear to both sides. This wasn't going to be quick. This was going to be a war of attrition, a test of will, a struggle that would consume years and lives and resources. The empire had started this believing the fortress was insignificant. They would learn, slowly and painfully, that in warfare, significance isn't determined by size. It's determined by strategic value and the will of defenders. And this desert fortress had both. Rising action, the grinding years. The first year of the siege established the pattern that would continue for decades. The empire would attack. The defenders would repel the attack. Both sides would take casualties. The siege would continue. The imperial army tried every conventional tactic. Direct assaults that broke against determined defenders. Attempts to tunnel under the walls that collapsed in the shifting desert. Sand. Siege towers that were burned before they could reach the battlements. They tried to starve the fortress out, but the defenders had deep storage and rationed carefully, making their supplies last far longer than seemed possible. Most frustratingly for the attackers, the fortress had those wells. Water in the desert was life, and the defenders controlled it. The Imperial army had to bring water from 100 miles away, a logistical nightmare that consumed resources and limited how many soldiers could be sustained around the fortress. The defenders could outlast any blockade because they had what the attackers needed most. By the end of year 1, the Imperial commander had been replaced. He'd failed to take the fortress in a reasonable time frame. So a new officer was sent with fresh troops and orders to finish what his predecessor couldn't. The new commander tried different tactics. Bribery, offering defenders wealth and positions if they'd surrender. Some accepted and opened a gate during the night. But the betrayal was discovered. The defenders executed the traitors and redoubled their vigilance. The attempted infiltration cost the Imperials another 200 soldiers and gained them nothing. Year 2 saw the Empire commit even more resources. 10,000 soldiers now surrounded the fortress. Sophisticated siege equipment was brought across the desert at enormous cost. The Emperor himself had taken interest. This fortress was becoming an embarrassment, a symbol of Imperial failure. It had to be taken, but it wasn't. Attack after attack was repelled. The defenders had learned the patterns of Imperial assaults and prepared counters for each tactic. They'd turned the fortress into a death trap, with overlapping fields of fire, hidden positions, defensive measures that multiplied their effective strength. The desert itself became an ally. Summer temperatures in the desert were brutal, over 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, and there was no shade on the open sand where the Imperial army camped. Soldiers died of heat stroke. Equipment degraded in the harsh conditions. Supply lines were attacked by desert raiders who'd allied with the defenders. Sandstorms would periodically sweep through, causing chaos and misery for the besiegers while the fortress walls provided shelter for defenders. Year 3, Year 4, Year 5, the siege continued. Commanders were rotated through, each one determined to be the officer who finally captured the fortress. Each one failed. Soldiers who'd arrived as young recruits became veterans who'd known nothing but this endless desert siege. Some deserted, unable to cope with the monotony and danger. Others died, to disease, to defenders' arrows, to the brutal environment. Inside the fortress, life was equally hard. Supplies were always limited. Every casualty was irreplaceable. But the defenders had something the attackers lacked. They were home. Every stone in those walls was familiar. Every grave in the small cemetery held someone they'd known. They weren't fighting for an empire or a career. They were fighting to survive, to protect their families, to hold ground that belonged to them. Children grew up in the fortress, learning to fight almost before they could walk. The boy I mentioned at the beginning was born in year 4 of the siege. His father was a defender who'd held the walls since the siege began. The boy's first memories were of arrows falling, of his mother pulling him into shelter during attacks, of the constant awareness that enemies surrounded them and death was always close. By year 10, the siege had become famous, or infamous, throughout the empire. This tiny desert fortress had become a symbol of imperial frustration, of the limits of military power, of how determined defenders could resist overwhelming force. Other regions under imperial control took note. If a small fortress could hold for a decade, maybe rebellion was possible. Maybe the empire wasn't as invincible as it claimed. The emperors who ruled during these years all made the same decision. The fortress must fall. Not because it was strategically critical anymore. The empire had found alternate routes and abandoned the original campaign plan years ago. But because letting it stand meant admitting defeat, meant showing weakness. So resources continued to flow to the desert. Soldiers continued to die, and the siege continued. Year 15. The father of the boy born during the siege was killed during an assault, cut down by an arrow while defending the eastern wall. His son, now 11, watched from a distance as his father's body was carried to the cemetery and buried next to his grandfather's grave. The boy understood what this meant. When he was old enough, he'd take his place on those walls, defending against the same enemy that had killed his father and grandfather. New commanders tried new tactics. One attempted to build a massive ramp of sand and stone to reach the top of the walls, a monumental engineering project that took a year and consumed thousands of lives through defender attacks and desert conditions. When the ramp was finally completed and an assault launched, the defenders had prepared. They'd fortified the section of wall the ramp reached, creating a kill zone that massacred the attacking force. The ramp stood as a monument to futility, and the empire abandoned that approach. Another commander tried patience. No assaults, just a tight blockade to starve the fortress. This lasted 3 years before the emperor lost patience and demanded action. The blockade had failed anyway. The defenders somehow continued to receive limited supplies through desert routes the empire couldn't fully control. Year 20. 2 decades of siege. Entire careers had been consumed by this fortress. Soldiers had grown old here. The young boy was now a young man of 16, a skilled defender who'd known nothing but life in a besieged fortress. He fought alongside men who'd been there from the beginning, gray-bearded veterans who'd held these walls for 20 years. The empire had lost over 30,000 soldiers to this siege, killed in attacks, dead from disease and heat, casualties of a grinding attrition that never ended. The fortress defenders had been replaced multiple times as casualties mounted, but there were always volunteers. Families from the surrounding desert, refugees from other imperial conquests, people drawn by the fortress's legendary resistance. If you wanted to fight the empire, this was where you went. Climax, the final years. By year 25, everything had changed and nothing had changed. The empire had evolved. New emperors had risen. The military had modernized. But the fortress still stood, and the siege continued. The young man born during the siege was now a commander himself, having risen through the ranks through competence and the attrition that killed or disabled older officers. He was 30 years old and had never known peace. The fortress was his entire world. He'd never been beyond its walls, never experienced life without siege conditions, never known what it was like to live without enemies surrounding him. He commanded defenders who were mostly younger than the siege itself. The original garrison was long dead, killed in battles, succumbed to disease, aged into graves in the fortress cemetery. But new defenders had taken their places, and the resistance continued. The empire made one final massive effort. A new emperor had taken power, and he declared that the fortress would fall during his reign. He committed 50,000 soldiers, an enormous force that dwarfed previous attempts. New siege technologies were deployed. The most experienced commanders were assigned to the task. This would be the final assault. The attack was overwhelming. Coordinated assaults from multiple directions. Siege equipment that was more advanced than anything used before. Tactics refined by 27 years of trial and error. Wave after wave of soldiers throwing themselves at walls that had stood for a generation. The defenders fought with desperate courage. They knew this might be the end, that this assault was different from all the others, that the empire had finally committed enough resources to overwhelm them. But they fought anyway, making every foot of ground cost the attackers dearly. The siege commander himself, now 32 years old, fought on the walls alongside his men. An arrow caught him in the chest during the 3rd day of the final assault. He was carried from the walls, bleeding, knowing he was dying. His mother, the woman who'd buried her husband and father during earlier years of the siege, held him as he bled out in the fortress courtyard. His last words were a question: did they breach the walls? His second-in-command, standing nearby, answered honestly, no, the walls still hold. The young commander smiled, coughed blood, and died. He was buried in the cemetery next to his